Today, let's examine one of the most disturbing and contradictory stories in the Bible, the so-called Massacre of the Innocents. In the New Testament of the Bible, only Matthew and Luke describe the birth of Jesus, yet they tell very different stories. These differences reveal that we are not dealing with history, we are dealing with fabricated tales disguised as divine truth. In Matthew chapter 2, some wise men from the east arrive in Jerusalem to visit the newborn Jesus. They meet King Herod and ask him, "Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews?" Herod, fearing the loss of his throne, sees the child as a threat. In response, he orders the slaughter of all baby boys in Bethlehem, who were 2 years old or under. Joseph, the earthly father of Jesus, is warned by an angel in a dream. Acting on this warning, he takes Mary and Jesus and flees to Egypt, escaping the massacre. But dozens of innocent children were still killed by Herod after Jesus' family escaped. The family remains in Egypt until Herod dies, after which they return to Israel. Now compare this with Luke's account, and the differences become immediately striking. Luke tells a very different story. There is no massacre, no flight to Egypt, and no murderous Herod chasing Jesus. Instead, Joseph and Mary take Jesus to the temple in Jerusalem, offer a sacrifice according to the Jewish law, and then return quietly to their hometown of Nazareth. These differences are not minor. One gospel describes mass infanticide and a desperate escape to Egypt, while the other describes a calm, peaceful journey. Both accounts cannot be historically accurate. So why did Matthew include such a horrific story? The answer lies in the Old Testament and his theological motive. When Moses was born in Egypt, in the Old Testament, the Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, ordered the killing of Hebrew infants, yet Moses escaped. Matthew deliberately recreated this story to present Jesus as the new Moses and the promised prophet. This was not real history. It was symbolic storytelling meant to show Jesus as a divine fulfillment of Scripture. By borrowing this older story, Matthew made Jesus' life look like a continuation of God's plan for Israel, signaling to Jewish readers that he was the long-awaited Messiah. Some Christians argue just because the stories are similar doesn't mean Matthew copied. Maybe God orchestrated both events to show a divine pattern. But this actually makes the problem worse. If God truly repeated the same cruel event, slaughter of infants, just to illustrate a pattern, then God is portrayed as deliberately causing immense suffering to innocent families. That is not divine wisdom. It is cruelty. The simpler and more logical explanation is that Matthew was reshaping an older story to support his theological agenda. Even if we set aside theological motives, the story also raises a serious historical question. If such a horrific massacre really occurred, would it have gone completely unrecorded? The massacre of children is an event so shocking that historians of the time would surely have recorded it. Yet Josephus, who wrote extensively about Herod's cruelty, makes no mention of such an atrocity. No Roman, Jewish, or other ancient record mentions it. If hundreds of children had been slaughtered, history would not remain silent. This strongly suggests Matthew invented the story. The story becomes even more problematic when we examine the so-called flight to Egypt. Matthew links the massacre to Joseph's flight to Egypt. If Herod only killed children in Bethlehem, why flee all the way to Egypt? Why not simply move to a nearby town? John the Baptist, who was also under 2 years old and lived nearby in Judea, survived without ever being taken far away. If staying just outside Bethlehem was enough to protect John, why was it necessary for Jesus and his family to travel all the way to Egypt? These questions highlight the inconsistency in Matthew's narrative. The story seems designed to fit Matthew's theological agenda, to claim that Jesus fulfilled the Old Testament prophecy in the book of Hosea chapter 11 verse 1, "Out of Egypt I called my son." Rather than reporting actual events, Matthew is manipulating geography and timing to create a prophecy fulfillment. Beyond historical inconsistencies, the story also raises serious moral questions. If the massacre had actually occurred, God knowingly allowed dozens, perhaps hundreds of innocent babies to die so that one child could survive. If angels could warn Joseph to protect Jesus, why not warn the other parents as well? The story portrays a God who chooses one child over many, which is morally indefensible and inconsistent with the concept of a loving, just deity. Matthew compounds these issues by claiming the massacre fulfilled a prophecy. Matthew cites from the Old Testament book of Jeremiah chapter 31 verse 15. A voice was heard in Ramah, Rachel weeping for her children because they are no more. But Jeremiah was writing about Israelite captives being taken to Babylon, not about infants being killed in Bethlehem centuries later. Ramah is north of Jerusalem, not near Bethlehem. By ripping Jeremiah's words out of context, Matthew twisted scripture to create a fulfilled prophecy that never existed. This shows deliberate manipulation, not divine inspiration. When we look at the full picture, a pattern emerges. From Egypt to Bethlehem to Ramah, Matthew repeatedly bends and twists scripture to fit his agenda. He wanted to convince Jewish readers that Jesus was the Messiah by showing that every detail of his life fulfilled prophecy. Where the Old Testament did not naturally fit, Matthew simply invented stories to force the connection. The massacre of the innocents is not a historical event, it is a theological invention. It is filled with moral problems, unrecorded by contemporary history, and based on false prophecy fulfillment. Matthew's deceptive use of scripture reveals human manipulation, not divine truth. So we are left with two possibilities. Either God repeated a pointless act of mass murder to create a theological pattern, or Matthew invented the story to make Jesus look like Moses. Both options undermine the credibility of the Bible. The contradiction between Matthew and Luke proves that these are not eyewitness accounts, they are fabricated tales.